Well, hello there. Welcome to My Life as a Landlord. I am Dr. Jen, and I am so pleased that you are here today. I'm pleased that I'm here today too because I'm sick as a dog, and it is 5:30 on a Friday night, and I am making sure that even though I am sick, that I am okay to record because that's what we do. We do it anyway. So here I be. Anyway, thanks for being here. Appreciate you listening. We are rolling right along in our six-part tenant screening series. I want to make sure that you are paying attention when you are screening the humans that are going to be living in your asset. Last week we talked about marketing your property to attract the right people. How can you make a first impression the moment you hit publish on your advertising ads? So if you missed that episode, go back to last week's episode about marketing. But today we're looking at wallets. Today's episode two, show me the money. Credit and income are usually the biggest and first big filters that we use in tenancy screening. Why? Because landlords are lenders, more than you would use for like a car lease. Why is that any different than a landlord leasing their home, right? It's the same thing. If you're just looking at the three-digit credit score and calling it a day, you are likely missing the whole story. So that this is the question of what do you do when things are kind of weird? What if you deny somebody on a gut feeling about their income source rather than you don't have your criteria that you're doing your screening, your tenancy screening written down? It's not published. So you've got to be careful because you can get yourself into legal hot water if you're not doing this properly. But we're going to talk today about how to read a credit report. And oh, by the way, because I am a landlord in the US and in Canada, we're going to talk about both. I've got examples for both. And we're going to talk about the weird cases like gig workers who don't have like a W-2 or a T4 job. We're going to talk about retirees and first-time renters, not just young people, but people that maybe are showing up from another country and have no credit where the rental is. So we're going to talk about all that. So what does a credit report actually tell you? Well, if you're reading the report and not just the score, which I really implore you on both to read both, get the credit report and the credit score. If you look at what it's saying, it shows payment history, account types, collections, and if you're very savvy, you will also notice if there's any mismatches in addresses, phone numbers. Sometimes it says employment. Like there's a lot that you can read in between the edges of what a credit report will tell you or what it won't tell you, right? So you want to be careful. You're looking for patterns, you're looking for red flags, things that don't align with whatever they've told you before, because in tenancy screening, you're in a trust but verify situation. So if you're looking at a credit report and you see a single negative report, like a $50 phone bill from, 3 months ago, 3 years ago, whatever, probably fine. Not a trend. You're looking for trends. And typically what I find, if you're finding red flags on the credit report, like the address doesn't align, the date of birth doesn't align, there's something that's kind of missing, that's probably not the only red flag. That's typically how this goes down. In a recent pattern, if you're seeing in credit reporting, if there is a recent pattern of things like not paying utility bills or just letting, cell phone things go or a car repossession, things like that. If you're seeing lots and lots of negative reports historically, especially recent historic, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to that because again, a landlord is a lender. Now, of course, in everything that you do, make sure you're getting written consent before pulling a credit report. And of course, if you're concerned about any or all of this, you need to seek legal counsel, talk to legal aid, someone in your local area where your rentals are, not where you are, but where your rentals are. But you've got to get written consent before pulling a credit report. Now, I have to put a big asterisk on this because I'm talking to the Canadian landlords here, because the Canadian landlords are the ones that can pull and pay for credit records, credit reports, but they pay for it. On the US side, yes, the US tenant application, they have tenant applicants, they have to pay for it. Now, either you have to be careful here because if they've paid you an application fee and you can pull their credit, it's a little bit tricky on the US side. So just be mindful, but either way, you have to have consent before doing anything. So we got to go from there. If you deny someone based on credit, then you likely have to provide a justification why. Like in the US, you've got to provide an adverse action notice. It's a standard under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and similar privacy and consumer reporting laws apply in Canada under PAPITA. For those of you who don't know what that is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. But the biggest thing is that you've got to alert the tenant applicant that you want to check their credit and that they consent to check their credit, regardless of where you are. So you need to make sure you're clear about all that. All right, let's look at an example about pulling credit. This one's in Texas. A landlord pulled a credit report and saw a score of 580. So that's low, okay? The person immediately denied the applicant. But if they'd have looked closer, they would have seen that the applicant had a pristine 10-year rental history and a steady job. The low score apparently was entirely due to a massive disputed medical bill from emergency surgery. By contrast, oh, here's another example in Alberta. A landlord in Alberta saw a 620 score, which, somewhere would be a C or maybe even a B. But notice the applicant had three accounts currently in collections and a cell phone bill and a payday loan, all current. So the Canadian landlord correctly identified the pattern of financial instability and denied the application based on the written criteria. Again, the written criteria is published as a landlord, right? The lesson is read the report, don't just glance at the store. And usually if someone's got a low credit score and then there's like other stuff in the report, there is a story. And that's the biggest thing for me is what is the story? Now, what about first-time renters, students, new immigrants, somebody who doesn't have a credit score yet? Now, having no credit is not the same as having bad credit. I'm going to say that again. Having no credit is not the same as having bad credit. You need to have alternative ways to assess the risk, especially if someone is trying to prove that they have on-time payments for things like cell phones or utilities elsewhere. You can look at bank statements and see if they're consistently paying on time, paying balances. The other alternative you can do, and that I do frequently, is you can require either a co-signer or a guarantor. I like co-signers better for a number of reasons. Mainly, that just keeps their name on the documents, and it also makes sure that they're a guarantor as well, but their name is on the lease. But the key is to have a written policy for no credit applicants, and then apply it to everybody. What you do for one, you must do for all, right? And so this is really important because you want to make sure that legally you're doing the exact same steps every single time, and that you're not discriminating even unknowingly, right? That's really important. Okay, so let's talk about yet another example. And because I've got tenants in BC, let's do a Vancouver-based example. So if an international student moving to Vancouver, BC, probably UBC for university, they will very likely have zero Canadian credit history. So if you have a policy for as a hard no for any no credit, you might be missing out on a massive tenant pool in that market. Instead, your policy could state something like applicants with no credit history must provide proof of enrollment, proof of sufficient funds in a Canadian bank account to cover the lease term, or a qualified co-signer or guarantor. It's objective, fair, and safe, and can be applied across the board. Now, I will tell you, as a as a person who operates in BC, that the enrollment, at least previous enrollment for international students in UBC, was so high that there was no shortage. The demand was so high that there was no shortage of applicants. And so you really wanted to be selective, but you also didn't want to discriminate by just ignoring people, right? So it's really interesting. Now, I also learned of an example somewhere in the States, somewhere, I don't recall exactly where, but they were using a company like Turbo Tenant to check credit and to check criminal record status, right? They were getting one of those verification blocks thing from like Turbo Tenant or Mr. Tenant or Mr. Landlord or any of those. The checks came back with nothing noted. And now here's the kicker though. The landlord failed to ask the applicant for a government ID, government picture ID. And so when they submitted for the checks, for the background check, criminal record check, credit check, all those things, they didn't pick up that they had um, all kinds of different problems, right? Criminal history, credit history. They had been evicted. There was all kinds of issues because they had applied under either a nickname or a pseudonym or something. And so that's another trick if you are requiring the credit checks, which is quite industry standard. Make sure that you're also using that government ID and that it's valid. I've had other people do that for me as well. This is the first thing I look at. I look at the ID and I go, when is the expiration date? Sometimes they're invalid, meaning, and I just simply either email them back or text them back and say, unfortunately, this one's not valid. Do you have an ID that is valid? It's pretty simple, right? But you want to do that. And that leads right into your all your different checks, because how can you check your court records if you don't have their correct legal name? Well, get an ID, that'll help you. So, as I mentioned, typically in the US, the applicant pays for the credit report, and in Canada, typically it's the landlord footing the bill for the credit checks. And especially in Canada, when I'm paying to pull the credits, it's 26 bucks per pull. So I always want to make sure I get it right, because if you put the wrong information in and it comes back with no credit, no history, no transactions, whatever, and then you realize after that you've put in like the wrong name or you're off or whatever, yeah, you don't get your money back. So anyway, let's see. Now, what if the credit is genuinely bad, right? Distinguish between old issues like old medical debt. In the 2009 housing crash, there were so many people, including myself and my husband. We both lost houses in that. Yes, I know it's hard to believe, but yes, you do survive things like foreclosure, right? So, but you want to look at the age of whatever is causing the credit score to be low, right? You want to look at why it is. But you also want to take into account the timing, right? And is it a trend? Is it repeated non-payments of basic living expenses? Is it the same thing all the time? So if your criteria is to allow for it, you can mitigate risk by requiring a security deposit or a cosigner. Now, if you wanted to do a higher security deposit, that highly depends on where your rental is, right? There's a lot of places that are limited by maximum security deposits. Now, not all of them, especially in the States. There's a bunch of places where security deposit amounts can be anything, or they deliberately can be higher based on risk mitigation things. But you always want to check your local laws depending on the security deposit limits. So in the US, as I mentioned, for example, California, there's no statutory limit on security deposits. So you could potentially ask for 2 months rent to offset the risk of someone who had like a 550 credit score. But as an aside, in Ontario, Canada, the Residential Tenancy Act strictly limits the security deposit to exactly 1 month's rent, and it can only be applied to the last month's tenancy. You cannot ask for a higher deposit. BC's the same way, right? You can't do that, but you must rely on a guarantor or a cosigner, or you have to deny the application, which I've done that in the past, where I've had to say, hey, you either need a cosigner, or unfortunately we can't move forward, right? Again, consistency is your best friend here. What you do for one is you do for all, and you just take all of that information and you do the same system again and again. Now, if you don't have a lot of rentals, make sure you are either videotaping how you're doing it, or that you're writing a system down, because if you only screen a tenant every once in a while, whatever that may be, once a year or once a month, whatever it is, make sure that you at least have your systems down, right? This is really important. But let's talk about income, right? We talked about credit, but let's talk about income. The industry standard typically is requiring gross monthly income to be between 2 and 3 times the rent, right? So if your rent is 2,000 a month, then you are going to require that they're making somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 per month, depending if utilities are included, all of that stuff. But you want to make sure that that you can verify their income, right? So that's that. If it's wages, it's pretty easy. They send you a pay stub, right? Now, I have had people fake pay stubs. How? What they've done is they've gone to to companies on the website and they've just taken a screenshot of the logo and they've thrown it in a Word document with their information. It looks very official. And I just, you can take it at face value, but you have to be careful. And what I've done in the past is I will go to the company's website and look and see, is that the right logo? Is that their contact information? And you can call. The problem is that sometimes you can't get any income information because who are you, right? You're not even their landlord, and even if you were their landlord, they can't actually disclose anything. But does this person work here? Yes or no, right? Depending on who you're talking to, they can confirm employment or not. And that's how I say it is, I'm just trying to confirm employment, right? So be careful because sometimes people will fake these pay stubs because they've just been let go or something else is going on. But if you find that, talk about a big red flag. Oh my gosh, they just faked a document. No, no, thank you. Go on to the next one. Okay, so, but you want to be careful when you're talking income because there's other ways of looking at income, pensions, government benefits, assistance, child support, and consistent self-employment, right? These are sometimes can be hard to justify, but these are some of the weird edge cases that we're talking about. So let's talk about an edge case of a new job. So if they're moving somewhere for work, ask for an official letter or an offer letter or HR verification that they are indeed coming. And in fact, that's what I do for my rentals in Powell River. If someone is relocating and they've reached out to me to have a lease so they have somewhere to be when they land, the main thing is I want a copy of your offer letter. And they'll have it because that's what they're using to apply to other places as well, right? So that, and it's not unreasonable. You can verify their income off of the offer letter. You can see their start date as well. And so there's a couple different places that you can do that. But for the edge case of someone who is a saver, who has no job but has ample savings, a massive savings account like a retiree that has an income from their investments, they still have income, right? So, but you've got to define the policy. You've got to have your criteria set on how you're going to do not only credit, but also income. Now, the example says you must have liquid assets equal to 3 years of rent. I don't think that's realistic, but it could be a policy. I don't have a policy like that stated, but I go, you know what? If they're making $4,000 or $5,000 a month based on their investments, I don't care that they have a big savings account. I can see what they're making in their investments and their income. But let's talk about a real world scenario. A landlord in Florida had an applicant who was a self-employed graphic designer, and they didn't have a W-2, or for my Canadian friends, it's a T4. And their tax returns from the previous year were low due to heavy business write-offs. So the landlord asked for 12 months of business bank statements to verify consistent recurring deposits that met the 3 times rent criteria. And the applicant provided them, and the income was verified and they were approved. So there you go. But if the income is completely unverifiable, like cash jobs, right? Like all kinds of cash things that you can all name, this is a legitimate reason for denial, provided that it's in your written criteria. Say, look, it has to be verifiable income. Now that I do have in my tenant application screening criteria. So make sure you've got it. Okay, short and sweet. Money talks. These are the edge cases. They're very weird, but they're real world. What do you do with them? Sometimes money talks, but it doesn't always tell the whole story. We've covered the finances, but what happens when a background check reveals a criminal record? How do you balance keeping your property safe with following a strict fair chance housing laws, right? There are places that have that. So next week on My Life as a Landlord, we're tackling the complex world of criminal history and background checks in the episode 3 of 6 for tenancy screening series. That's episode 229. We'll discuss what you can and cannot ask and how to handle these sensitive situations legally, especially in your local markets. It's a must listen for keep your business compliant and your community safe. Today, I'm recording this episode in Powell River, BC, right outside my new RV park that is coming operational, and I'm learning all about the differences between tenancy and license to occupy. Oh boy, that sounds so good. More stuff coming up on that. I will see you next week.